Brian Fitzgerald did not feel easy in his mind, and he would have felt still less so had he known that the man he had observed staring at him so closely was Mr. Samuel Gorby, one of the cleverest of the Melbourne detectives. Mr. Gorby had been watching the Frettlby mansion the whole evening. He did not know where Fitzgerald lived and was determined to watch his movements and to trace him home. But his patience had been pretty severely tried, for hour after hour had passed and no one had appeared. Gorby smoked several pipes and watched the people strolling along in the soft silver moonlight. A bevy of girls passed by with their arms round one another's waists. Then a young man and woman, evidently lovers, came walking along. They sat down by Mr. Gorby and looked hard at him, to hint that he need not stay. But the detective took no heed of them and kept his eyes steadily upon the great house opposite. Finally the lovers took themselves off, with a very bad grace. Then Mr. Gorby had seen Madge and Brian come out onto the veranda, and heard in the stillness of the night a sound weird and unearthly. It was a young lady singing. Eventually he saw Madge go in, shortly followed by Brian. The latter had turned and stared at him for a moment. "Ah," said Gorby to himself as he relit his pipe, "your consciences are smiting you, is it? Wait a bit, my boy, till I have you in jail." Then at last Brian came down the path with Frettlby at his side and Madge hanging on her father's arm. Frettlby opened the gate and held out his hand. "Good night, Fitzgerald. Come soon again." "Good night, sir." "Good night, Brian, dearest," said Madge, kissing him. "And don't forget tomorrow." Then father and daughter closed the gate, leaving Brian outside, and walked back to the house. "Ah," said Mr. Gorby to himself, "if you only knew what I know, you wouldn't be so precious kind to him." Brian strolled along till he was opposite the Esplanade Hotel. Then he leaned his arms on the fence and, taking off his hat, enjoyed the calm beauty of the hour. The night was perfectly still. Not a breath of wind stirred, for what breeze there had been had long since died away. But Brian could see the white wavelets breaking lightly on the sands. The long, narrow pier ran out like a black thread into the sheet of gleaming silver, and away in the distance the line of the Williamstown lights sparkled like some fairy illumination. Somewhat to the annoyance of Mr. Gorby, who had no eye for the picturesque, Brian gazed at the sky for several minutes, admiring the wonderful beauty of its broken masses of light and shade. At length he turned and walked to the St. Kilda station, for on looking at his watch he had found that he would just have time to catch the last train. He arrived a few minutes before it started. Getting into the smoking carriage at the near end of the platform, he lit a cigarette and, leaning back in his seat, watched the latecomers hurrying for the train. Just as the last bell rang, he saw a man rush along the platform. It was the same man who had been watching him the whole evening. "Damnation," he muttered softly. "I expect he will follow me to East Melbourne and find out where I live. But he shan't if I can help it." As he stepped out onto the platform at the Melbourne station, he looked round apprehensively, as if he half expected to feel a hand upon his shoulder. But he saw no one at all, and with a sigh of relief he left the station. Mr. Gorby, however, was not far away. Brian walked slowly along Flinders Street, apparently deep in thought. He turned up Russell Street and did not stop until he found himself close to the Burke and Wills monument, the exact spot where the cab had pulled up on the night of White's murder. "Ah," said the detective to himself as he stood in the shadow on the opposite side of the street. "You're going to have a look at it, are you? I wouldn't if I were you. It's dangerous." Fitzgerald then hailed a hansom. Gorby was rather perplexed at this sudden move, but without delay he hailed another cab and told the driver to follow the first till it stopped. The cab in front kept driving on, through an interminable maze of streets, until it seemed as though Brian were determined to drive the whole night. At last, though, it stopped, and Gorby saw his quarry alight and dismiss his cabman. He then walked off down the street. "Confound it," said the detective as he got out and paid his fare, which was by no means a light one. "We've come in a circle." Brian then disappeared into the Treasury Gardens. Gorby followed. Passing over the bridge, with the water rippling quietly underneath, Brian left the gardens by the end gate. Then he went along the Wellington Parade and turned up Powlett Street, where he stopped at a house near Cairns Memorial Church, much to Mr. Gorby's relief, who, being like Hamlet, fat and scant of breath, found himself rather exhausted. He kept well in the shadow, however, and saw Fitzgerald give one final look round before he disappeared into the house. Then Mr. Gorby, like the robber captain in Ali Baba, took careful stock of the building and fixed its locality and appearance firmly in his mind. In spite of his long walk and longer drive, Brian did not sleep well that night. He could not help giving a start of surprise when he saw his face reflected in the mirror, old and haggard-looking, with dark circles round the eyes. "A pleasant life I'll have of it, if this sort of thing goes on," he said bitterly. "I wish I'd never seen or heard of Oliver White." The change in his appearance did not escape the eye of his landlady. A look of dismay came over her stony little countenance. "Dear me, sir," she chirped out in her shrill voice, "are you took bad?" Brian shook his head. "Want to sleep, that's all, Mrs. Sampson."
"Ah, that's because you ain't got enough blood in your head,"
said Mrs. Sampson wisely, for she had her own ideas on the subject of health.
"If you ain't got blood, you ain't got sleep."
Brian looked at her as she said this, for there seemed such an obvious want of blood in her own veins that he wondered if she had ever slept in all her life. "I am going down to St. Kilda, Mrs. Sampson," he said, "and I'm going to bring Mr. Frettleby and his daughter to have a cup of afternoon tea here, so you might have some ready."
"You have only to ask and to have,"
answered Mrs. Sampson hospitably. As soon as Fitzgerald had gone, she went over to the window and watched him as he walked slowly down the street, a tall, handsome man of whom any woman would be proud.
"What an awful thing it are to think he'll be a corpse some day,"
she chirped cheerily to herself.
"Oh, now, who are you, impertinence?"
as a stout man crossed the road and rang the bell. Mr. Gorby had seen Brian go out, and deeming it a good opportunity for inquiry, had lost no time in making a start.
"You nearly tore the bell down," said Mrs. Sampson, as she presented her thin body and wrinkled face to the view of the detective.
"I'm very sorry," answered Gorby. "I'll knock next time. Does Mr. Fitzgerald live here?"
"He do," replied Mrs. Sampson, "but he's gone out, and won't be back till the afternoon."
"I'm glad he's not in," said Mr. Gorby. "Would you allow me to have a few moments' conversation?" She looked at him with her sharp little eyes, and seeing nothing disreputable about him, led the way upstairs, crackling loudly the whole time. This so astonished Mr. Gorby that he cast about in his own mind for an explanation of the phenomenon. "Wants oiling about the joints," was his conclusion, "but I never heard anything like it. And she looks as if she'd snap in two, she's that brittle." Mrs. Sampson took Gorby into Brian's sitting room, and having closed the door, sat down and prepared to hear what he had to say for himself. "I want to know a few things about Mr. Fitzgerald's habits."
"And what for?"
"I am an insurance agent, and Mr. Fitzgerald desires to insure his life in our company. I therefore want to find out if he is a good life to insure. Does he live temperately, keep early hours, and in fact all about him?"
"I shall be happy to answer any inquiries which may be of use to you, sir."
"Is he a temperate man?"
"I never saw him the worse for drink. He been always able to use his latchkey and take his boots off before going to bed, which is no more than a woman ought to expect from a lodger, she having to do her own washing." And he keeps good hours? Always in afore the clock strikes 12. Mr. Gorby was keenly disappointed at this answer. Is he always in before 12? Mrs. Sampson eyed him waggishly, and a smile crept over her wrinkled little face. Young men have not been old men, she replied cautiously, and sinners not been saints. It's not natural as latchkeys should be made for ornament instead of use. And Mr. Fitzgerald being one of the handsomest men in Melbourne, it ain't to be expected as he should let his latchkey get rusty, though, having a good moral character, he uses it with moderation. But I suppose you are seldom awake when he comes in really late, said the detective. Not as a rule, assented Mrs. Sampson. Been a heavy sleeper and much disposed for bed, but I have heard him coming out at 12. The last time being Thursday week. Oh. Mr. Gorby drew a long breath, for Thursday week was the night upon which the murder was committed. And the time was? He asked breathlessly. 5 minutes to 2 o'clock, replied Mrs. Sampson. Mr. Gorby thought for a moment. Cab was hailed at 1 o'clock. Started for St. Kilda at about 10 minutes past. Reached grammar school, say, at 25 minutes past. Fitzgerald talks 5 minutes to cabman, making it past. Say he waited 10 minutes for another cab to turn up, makes it 20 minutes to. It would take another 20 minutes to get back to East Melbourne and 5 minutes to walk up here. That makes it 5 minutes past 2 instead of before. Confound it. Was your clock in the kitchen right? Well, it does get a little slow sometimes, not having been cleaned for some time, which me nevvy being a watchmaker always hands it over to him. Of course. It was slow on that night. He must have come in at 5 minutes past 2, which makes it right. Makes what right? And how do you know my clock was 10 minutes wrong? Oh, it was it? Asked Gorby eagerly. I'm not denying of it, replied Mrs. Sampson. Clocks ain't always to be relied on more than men and women. But it won't be anything again his insurance, will it, as in general he's in before 12? Oh, all that will be quite safe, answered the detective, delighted with the information he had obtained. Here a ring at the front doorbell called Mrs. Sampson away, so with a hurried word to Gorby she crackled downstairs. Left to himself, Mr. Gorby arose and looked round the room. It was excellently furnished, and the pictures were good. At one end of the room, by the window, there was a writing table covered with papers. "It's no good looking for the document he took out of White's pocket, I suppose," said the detective to himself as he turned over some letters, "as I don't know what it is, and I couldn't tell it if I saw it. But I'd like to find that missing glove and the bottle that held the chloroform, unless he's done away with them. There doesn't seem any sign of them here, so I'll have a look in his bedroom." There was no time to lose, as Mrs. Sampson might return at any moment, so Mr. Gorby walked quickly into the bedroom which opened off the sitting-room. The first thing that caught the detective's eye was a large photograph in a plush frame of Madge Frettlby. It stood on the dressing-table, and was similar to that one which he had already seen in White's album. He took it up with a laugh. "You're a pretty girl, but you give your photograph to two young men, both in love with you and both hot-tempered. The result is that one is dead, and the other won't survive him long. That's what you've done." He put it down again, and looking round the room, caught sight of a light, fawn-coloured coat hanging behind the door, and also a soft hat. "Ah," said the detective, going up to the door, "here is the very coat you wore when you killed that poor fella. I wonder what you have in the pockets." And he plunged his hand into them in turn. There were an old theatre programme and a pair of brown gloves in one, but in the second pocket Mr. Gorby made a discovery, none other than that of the missing glove. There it was, a white kid glove for the right hand with black bands down the back. And the detective smiled in a gratified manner as he put it carefully in his pocket. "My morning has not been wasted. I found out that he came in at a time which corresponds to all his movements after 1 o'clock on Thursday night, and this is the missing glove, which clearly belonged to White. If I could only get hold of the chloroform bottle, I'd be satisfied.
But the chloroform bottle was not to be found, though he searched most carefully for it. At last, hearing Mrs. Sampson coming upstairs again, he gave up the search and came back to the sitting-room.
"Threw it away, I suspect," he said as he sat down in his old place. "But it doesn't matter. I think I can form a chain of evidence from what I have discovered which will be sufficient to convict him. Besides, I expect when he is arrested he will confess everything. He seems to feel remorse for what he has done." "You need not tell Mr. Fitzgerald I've been here," he said to the landlady. "I'll call back later and see him myself." It was a broiling hot day, one of those cloudless days with the blazing sun beating down on the arid streets and casting deep black shadows, a real Australian December day dropped by mistake of the clerk of the weather into the middle of August. The previous week having been really chilly, it was all the more welcome. It was Saturday morning, and fashionable Melbourne was doing the block. Collins Street is to the southern city what Bond Street and the Row are to London, and the Boulevard to Paris. It is on the block that people show off their new dresses, bow to their friends, cut their enemies, and chatter small talk. The same thing no doubt occurred in the Appian Way, the fashionable street of Imperial Rome, when Catullus talked gay nonsense to Lesbia, and Horace received the congratulations of his friends over his new volume of society verses. History repeats itself, and every city is bound by all the laws of civilization to have one special street wherein the votaries of fashion can congregate. Collins Street is not, of course, such a grand thoroughfare as those above mentioned, but the people who stroll up and down the broad pavement are quite as charmingly dressed and as pleasant as any of the peripatetics of those famous cities. As the sun brings out bright flowers, so the seductive influence of the hot weather had brought out all the ladies in gay dresses of innumerable colours, which made the long street look like a restless rainbow. Carriages were bowling smoothly along, their occupants smiling and bowing as they recognised their friends on the sidewalk. Lawyers, their legal quibbles finished for the week, were strolling leisurely with their black bags in their hands. Portly merchants walked beside their pretty daughters, and the representatives of swelldom were stalking along in their customary apparel of curly-brimmed hats, high collars, and immaculate suits. Madge Frettlby was engaged in that occupation so dear to every female heart, shopping. She was in Mowbray, Rowan, and Hicks, turning over ribbons and laces, while the faithful Brian waited for her outside and amused himself by looking at the human stream which flowed along the pavement. He disliked shopping quite as much as the majority of his sex, and it was difficult to drive away the thoughts of his pleasant club, where he could be reading and smoking, with, perchance, something cooling in a glass beside him. However, after she had purchased a dozen or more articles she did not want, Madge remembered that Brian was waiting for her and hurried to the door. "I haven't been many minutes, have I, dear?" she said, touching him lightly on the arm. "Oh, dear, no," answered Brian, looking at his watch. "Only 30. A mere nothing, considering a new dress was being discussed." "I thought I'd been longer," said Madge, her brow clearing. "But still I'm sure you feel a martyr." "Not at all," replied Fitzgerald, handing her into the carriage. "I enjoyed myself very much." "Nonsense," she laughed, opening her sunshade while Brian took his seat beside her. "James," she cried to the coachman, "drive to the Melbourne Club. Papa will be there, you know," she said to Brian, "and we'll take him off to have tea with us." "But it's only 1 o'clock," said Brian, as the town hall clock came into sight. "Mrs. Sampson won't be ready." "Oh, anything will do," replied Madge. "A cup of tea and some thin bread and butter isn't hard to prepare. I don't feel like lunch, and Papa eats so little in the middle of the day, and you eat a great deal at all times," finished Brian with a laugh. Madge went on chattering in her usual lively manner,
and Brian listened to her with delight. Her pleasant talk drove away the evil spirits which had been with him for the last 3 weeks. Suddenly Madge made an observation as they were passing the Burke and Wills monument, which startled him. "Isn't that the place where Mr. White got into the cab?" she asked, looking at the corner near the Scotch church, where a vagrant of musical tendencies was playing Just Before the Battle, Mother, on a battered old concertina. "So the papers say," answered Brian listlessly, without turning his head. "I wonder who the gentleman in the light coat could have been," said Madge, as she settled herself again. "No one seems to know." "Ah, but they have a clue. Do you know that he was dressed just like you, in a light overcoat and soft hat?" "How remarkable. He was dressed in the same manner as 9 out of every 10 young fellows in Melbourne." Madge looked at him in surprise at the tone in which he spoke, so different from his usual nonchalant way of speaking. She was about to answer when the carriage stopped at the door of the Melbourne Club. Brian, anxious to escape any more remarks about the murder, sprang quickly out and ran up the steps into the building. He found Mr. Frettlby smoking complacently.
"Ah, Fitzgerald. Have you left the attractions of Collins Street for the still greater ones of Clubland?"
"Not I. I've come to carry you off to afternoon tea with Madge and myself."
"I don't mind," answered Mr. Frettlby, rising, "but isn't afternoon tea at 1:30 rather an anomaly?"
"What's in a name?" said Fitzgerald absently as they left the room. "What have you been doing all morning?"
"I've been in here for the last half hour, reading."
"Wool market, I suppose?"
"No, the Hansom Cab murder."
"Oh, damn that thing," said Brian hastily. Then, seeing his companion looking at him in surprise, he apologized. "But indeed," he went on, "I'm nearly worried to death by people asking about White, as if I knew all about him, whereas I know nothing."
"Just as well you don't," answered Mr. Frettlby, as they descended the steps together. "He was not a very desirable companion."
It was on the tip of Brian's tongue to say, "And yet you wanted him to marry your daughter," but he wisely refrained, and they reached the carriage in silence. Mrs. Sampson was very much astonished at the early arrival of her lodger's guests, and did not hesitate to express her astonishment. "Been taken by surprise," she said with an apologetic cackle. "It ain't to be supposed as miracles can be performed with regard to cooking, the fire having gone out, and not been kept alight on account of the heat of the day, which was that hot as never was, though, to be sure, being a child in the early days, I remember it were that hot as my sister's aunt was in the habit of roasting her joints in the sun." After telling this last romance, and leaving her visitors in doubt whether the joints referred to belong to an animal or to her sister's aunt or to herself, Mrs. Sampson crackled away downstairs. "What a curious thing that landlady of yours is, Brian," said Madge, from the depths of a huge armchair. "I believe she's a grasshopper from the Fitzroy Gardens."
"Oh, no, she's a woman," said Mr. Frettlby cynically. "You can tell that by the length of her tongue."
"A popular error, Papa. I know plenty of men who talk far more than any woman."
"I hope I'll never meet them, then," said Mr. Frettlby, "for if I did I should be inclined to agree with De Quincey on murder as a fine art."
Brian winced at this, and looked apprehensively at Madge, and saw with relief that she was not paying attention to her father, but was listening intently. "There she is," as a faint rustle at the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Sampson and the tea-tray. "I wonder, Brian, you don't think the house is on fire with that queer noise always going on? She wants oil." Mrs. Sampson's shrill apologies for the absence of cake having been received, she hopped out of the room, and Madge poured the tea. The service was a quaint Chinese one which Brian had picked up in his wanderings. He used it only on special occasions. As he watched Madge, he could not help thinking how pretty she looked.
with her hands moving deftly among the cups and saucers, so bizarre-looking with their sprawling dragons of yellow and green. He half smiled to himself as he thought, if they knew all, I wonder if they would sit with me so unconcernedly. Mr. Frettlby, too, as he looked at his daughter, thought of his dead wife and sighed. Suddenly they heard a ring at the front door, and presently Mrs. Sampson talking in an excited manner at the pitch of her voice. Then the door of Brian's room was thrown open, and Gorby walked in. Fitzgerald turned as white as a sheet, for he felt instinctively that he had come for him. However, pulling himself together, he demanded in a haughty tone the reason of the intrusion. Mr. Gorby walked straight over to where Brian was standing and placed his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Brian Fitzgerald," he said in a clear voice, "I arrest you in the Queen's name." "For what?" asked Brian steadily. "The murder of Oliver White." At this, Madge gave a cry. "It is not true," she said wildly. "My God, it is not true!" Brian did not answer, but ghastly pale held out his hands. Gorby slipped the handcuffs onto his wrists with a feeling of compunction, despite his joy in running his man down. This done, Fitzgerald turned round to where Madge was standing, pale and still, as though turned into stone. She made a step forward, but her father moved before her. "Keep back. There is nothing between you and that man now." She turned round with an ashen face, but with a proud look in her clear eyes. "You are wrong. I love him more now than ever." Then, before her father could stop her, she placed her arms round her lover's neck and kissed him wildly. Brian kissed her passionately, then broke away. "Madge," he said in a clear, low voice, "I am going to prison, perhaps to death. But I swear to you, by all that I hold most sacred, that I am innocent of this murder."